Yeah, it's fantastic that an AI receptionist can book in 10 people, but if you're having to then go and check each of those, is the trade-off what you think it is? Bad feedback is different than a complaint. A complaint is, I came in, you treated the wrong arm, you cut the leg the wrong way. There's an issue that surfaces a complaint explicitly, which is different than, I had a bad experience and I'm unhappy. If you think about it from a surgical perspective, stop the bleeding. You have to stop the bleeding. Then you can make the body healthy again. That's a different problem. But first, you've got to stop the bleeding. And follow-up is how you stop the bleeding. Follow-up debt is how you stop the bleeding. And what we come to find is that they will look at a name and they'll say, oh yeah, that's this person's regular patient. See, that may be true, but this person's regular patient hasn't seen you in 24 months. And we had an experience once where the provider that we worked with was wonderful. They had incredible care for their patient body, but there was literally no way to get data out of the system with the exception of download, upload, and to do that on a 48-hour delay through TeamViewer remote access to complete a booking. That is a lot of friction to jump through. It is inevitable that people who are solving for service, in addition to solving for, are going to win the race. They're going to build differentiated brands. They're going to unlock word of mouth referral. They're going to cut their acquisition costs. They're going to have distribution that old school providers will simply not be able to hang on to. I think that evolution from transactional communication to relational communication is how you start to melt those barriers between patients who disengage and patients who are excited to come back.
Let's first talk about the importance of SOPs. What is SOP and why do clinics absolutely need it?
When we talk about SOPs, we're talking about standard operating procedures. And in a healthcare context, you can think of that in two ways. So one way is your clinical SOP, which is often looked after by the nurse, the practitioner, the doctor, the prescriber, whoever it might be, the surgeon. And that is typically to ensure clinical compliance so that you don't have unnecessary decision-making in the course of providing some kind of procedure or providing care of some kind. On the administrative side of the house, you will see booking procedures, booking standard operating procedures relating to patient intake. So what questions do we need to ask of the patient to make sure we can book them in? Do we need to screen them out for a certain reason? The thing that's really interesting is that as you push deeper into the SOPs with a clinic, you come to realize that there are all of these nuances. This patient needs to be booked with this practitioner, and they need 15 minutes more time than the standard appointment length because of reason 1, 2, 3. Or maybe the appointment issue itself needs to be a certain color as opposed to just being the standard color. Or maybe there's some kind of abbreviation that you want to add into the booking in order for the clinic team to really understand what it is that they're doing. And these nuances in the SOPs are a living, breathing organism. It's the thing that evolves with the clinic. And a new person will join the clinic team and they'll say, oh, in my old clinic, we actually used to do it that way. And that will get added to the SOP. And so you end up with this source of truth, almost like a Bible of how to handle patient concerns, patient considerations, and bookings. But the problem is that those SOPs are never really documented fully. They live half between people's brains and half on paper. And so you have all of this content that's lost from the SOP. And it's actually that context which enables you to start automating and to start thinking about reproducibility in the SOP rather than each thing being handled in a custom way. And for us, when we come into a practice, what we often find is that the SOP itself is not really robust. And so we start asking questions. Hey, how do you handle this? Hey, how do you handle that? What would you do if a patient said this? What would you do if a patient said that? And what we come to realize is that there is no service guideline. There are some basic questions. If they are this medical condition or this contraindication, then don't book them in. So you have a sort of surface level screening, but you don't really have strong conditions against which you can book certain patients for certain treatments. And the thing that's really interesting when you extrapolate that to the AI wave that we're currently confronting is that contextual knowledge needs to be documented. Otherwise, you are not actually solving the problem for the clinic. Because if you've got 8 people who call out of 10, and those 8 people are booked flawlessly, great outcome. But if you have 2 people who fall short of the ideal booking SOP, you have a problem because now the front of house team needs to not just go check those 2, but they need to check all 10. And so you have this big question mark around how much efficiency is actually being added. It's fantastic that an AI receptionist can book in 10 people, but if you're having to then go and check each of those, is the trade-off what you think it is? And it's for this reason that we make a meal of the SOP. We want to go in excruciating detail, almost in a surgical level of detail, to understand exactly how the clinic team wants to do things. Not how the clinic team wants to do things, but exactly the way the clinic team wants to do that, because then we can reproduce that action. We can reproduce that action with technology. We can reproduce that action with human patient coordinators, but we need to ensure that we have this source of truth. And oftentimes we find that clinics not only don't have it documented, but sometimes don't even have them at all. And that is a huge gap in terms of clinical and customer service and delivery inside of a healthcare environment. The place that clinics will usually focus with respect to SOPs is intake. So am I clinically and legally allowed to treat this patient? There's a lot of focus there, obviously. You don't want to have someone come in, as an example, if you're providing laser treatment for the skin. Usually you require that patient hasn't been in the sun for an extended period of time, otherwise you have interaction with pigmentation in the skin. There are certain intake questions that clinics are very focused on getting right, because you don't want to mistreat at risk of creating an issue not only for the patient, but also for the practice. But often that's where it stops. But we usually see the horror stories not at intake, but actually in recall. So we start reaching out to patients on behalf of a practice when we start working with them. And what we come to find is that there are issues that are not surfaced, and that those issues have no way of being resolved. There is no standard, here's how we resolve an issue in the healthcare provider setting, because the issues are often unknown altogether, because you're not engaged in the patient body. So as a simple example, we reach out to a patient body and we heard back, I came into the clinic and no consultant came to meet me. I just arrived and nobody was there. I emailed and no one responded. So where in the SOP are you checking that A, that correspondence is being picked up, and B, that it never happens? What sorts of checks and balances are in place with respect to the SOP to ensure that delivery doesn't miss? Another example, we had a patient that we heard back from a different provider, and they said, oh, I've been reaching out on WhatsApp to my practitioner, and I haven't heard back. I've been trying to book an appointment. The practitioner that they were reaching out to didn't work at the clinic anymore, but they had been exchanging messages while the practitioner was at the clinic via their personal WhatsApps. This actually happens all the time. We have a pediatrician that we used to work with who would give his personal WhatsApp number out to his patients because he found that was the easiest way to communicate. Now that's fine if you're the principal practitioner, in that you want to have that one-to-one dialogue, but what happens if it's happening in your workforce? Then suddenly you've got compliance issues, data security issues, privacy issues, management issues, all of which are removed from the practice. So it's great to have the intake SOP, but the horror stories that we see aren't when patients are coming in, but it's when they're in active management. How are they being managed? How are they being followed up with? Do you have clean correspondence history across all the channels? And how do you then issue and resolve in a way that doesn't feel like you're making it up on the fly? And I think oftentimes that is exactly how providers respond to patient issues. Here in the UK, you've got the Care Quality Commission, CQC. So part of CQC compliance means you need to have a very clear process by which you escalate and resolve issues. If a patient reaches out to you with a complaint, where does it go first? Where does it go second? Where does it go third? How do they escalate that outside the practice if they need to? So one of the things that we always ask for in the SOP guideline is, how do you handle bad feedback? This is not a complaint. Bad feedback is different than a complaint. A complaint is, I came in, you treated the wrong arm, you cut the leg the wrong way. There's an issue that surfaces a complaint explicitly, which is different than, I had a bad experience and I'm unhappy, but you only come to discover after you've reached out to the patient. These are different pathways. And what we often find is that clinics will respond with their issue escalation procedure. And they'll say, oh, first it goes here, then it goes here, and then it goes there. But that's the wrong pathway. For bad feedback and a complaint, different things. Complaint means I have a clinical issue with the service I received. Bad feedback was, I didn't have a great experience with a certain hygienist, with a certain practitioner, with a certain consultant. How do you handle that? And you could say, oh, we just escalated the same, but that escalation usually means going through a clinical pathway if there's a medical issue. Whereas if it's a service-based issue, where does it go? Does it go to the practice manager? Does it go to the front of house lead? Does it go to the head of patient experience? Does it go to the chief patient experience officer? There isn't that clarity around issue resolution if it's not on a clear-cut clinical pathway. And so that's one of the specific things that we ask for. The other thing that we always ask for is, who is your leading practitioner for new consultations? So a lot of patients will book into a practice, and in that first consult, you will expect the practitioner to establish trust with the relationship and to establish the treatment plan moving forward. Now, if that treatment plan is not delivered in a high confidence, humble, supportive way to the patient, in all likelihood, there isn't uptake in the same way that there might be for a practitioner who's doing a very good job in that initial consultation. A lot of practices have no data on their conversion metrics from an initial consultation based on practitioner. They just say, oh, we've got 60% conversion from consultation to first appointment. And the question is it 60% for every practitioner? Or is one of your practitioners delivering 100% conversion and then another one delivering 20% conversion and you're middling out at around 60%? So we always want to know for new lead inquiries, where do you put them first? Because that first touch point is really important, really powerful, has massive implications for your unit economics, has massive implications for your lifetime value and patient visit average. These are things that are really hard to tease out and have a massive impact on the clinic itself unless you are documenting that explicit protocol. First book with practitioner A, if not available, then book with practitioner B, if not available, then book with practitioner C. That detailing matters because it matters for profitability and it matters for business performance for the provider. We're living through a massive transition in how technology is built, deployed, and used today in a way that we weren't 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so if you look at the last generation of software in the CRM space, HubSpot is a great example. What HubSpot did is it gave you the ability to do things. You could receive an inbound inquiry. You could set up an automated correspondent touch point based on how they fill out your web form. You could schedule a phone call. You could do all of these things. And HubSpot, I think, as an example, was really about giving you the capability so that you didn't have to manage all that in a spreadsheet, because at a certain point, the spreadsheet no longer becomes viable. So that was, in quote, the old way. The new way is not about giving you the ability to do those things, but actually doing those things for you. So rather than asking you to set up a cadence, rather than asking you to set up a follow-up sequence, rather say, hey, here is the best performing sequence that we know from tens of thousands of data points on patient interaction. So one of the big differences between traditional CRM and the space that Coherent occupies is we're not giving you the buttons to do this yourself. We're saying, hey, we've been doing this. We've engaged with thousands of patients. This is what we see work. We see this time of day of week, this time of month, this weather on that day, this headline, this subject line, this copy, this length, this positioning. This is where we're seeing optimal outcomes. And hey, by the way, that's going to change because as we get more data and as we understand more about how patients interact with us, we're going to be able to improve your communication to patients rather than just saying, set up a static sequence and let it be triggered and delivered on repeat without anyone actually touching it. So one of the big differences between old school or the old way that CRM was built and the done for you model is that the done for you model comes with best practices. It comes with the specific engagement optimization for your audience. Your audience is healthcare, it is patients. And as much as these sort of live in contrast or in tension with each other, there's also a lot of collaboration between the two. So when we come into a provider that's using HubSpot or using Boxly, we're actually very excited because it means that there's a foundation for data capture. These are tools that have allowed you to pick up inbound interest and to look at that inbound interest over the course of a journey. And so rather than coming into a Google spreadsheet, which for some of our smaller providers is often the case, or rather than coming into something like Salesforce Health Cloud, which is an absolute monster with loads of information, coming into something which is relatively lightweight and built to match the practice's workflows is fantastic. Because for Coherent, we come in as the user. We come in and look at those tools and we say, okay, great, this is how you're using it right now. Here's how we can make it better. And here's how we can overlay what we know to deliver a better outcome for the provider. So we think there's a great opportunity here to be layering on know-how on the CRM side with tooling and to bring those things together to deliver great outcomes for the patient.
So can you talk about this thing called follow-up debt? How does missed follow-up quietly build up in a clinic? And why do clinic owners or operators only notice it when growth slows?
Yeah, great example was speaking with a healthcare provider. It's a integrated health, multidisciplinary MSK practice. And we were talking about what happens after a patient starts their journey. They've got about 60% conversion at lead inquiry to initial appointment. And then the question is what happens next? And the thing that's really interesting is that at each stage of the journey, you start to have drop off. Some people drop off after the second appointment, they drop off at the fourth appointment. Some people are actually on track, but then they cancel and life gets busy. And so they start to drift. Some people don't show up for an appointment. They never get followed up with. Other people complete a course of treatment, but actually in this case, ankle is still problematic, but nobody actually does the post-consultation review to say, okay, we actually need to continue the course of treatment. So along that journey, you've got leakage. That leakage is debt. It's operational debt, it's revenue debt, it's cost debt. You've got a growing number of patients who are sitting inactive, unsupported at different parts of the journey. And it is impossible to actively manage that journey for those patients because they all drop off at a certain different time in a different way. And unless you have hundreds and sometimes thousands of different re-engagement programs across that journey, you will have follow-up debt. So when we come into a practice, even though the practice might say, I want to focus on new leads, I want to focus on consultation conversion, we always say, no, we're going to start with patient recall. Why are we going to start with patient recall? Because in that body of patients, you will come to realize that there are not only untapped opportunities, but evidence of opportunities for improvement. You will hear from patients who are unhappy with their appointment. You will hear from patients who just dropped off and were excited to re-engage. You will hear from patients who had concerns that were never addressed. That body of information locked up inside of those past patient experiences is the follow-up debt. And you need to clear that debt because otherwise you're going to start pouring more volume on top of your early funnel. It's going to go all the way through and leak out. Recall is the bottom of your bucket. When people get to the end of the journey, when they start to drift off track, pulling them back in and ensuring you have clean flow from bottom of journey to top of journey is how you stop the bleeding. So for us, follow-up debt is the first point of intervention. If you think about it from a surgical perspective, stop the bleeding. You have to stop the bleeding. Then you can make the body healthy again. That's a different problem. But first, you've got to stop the bleeding. And follow-up is how you stop the bleeding. Follow-up debt is how you stop the bleeding.
So if clinics have their own recall system, why do so few actually bring patients back?
A lot of practices that we work with do recall. They have an app that they use. They have a bolt-on tool that they use. There are many reasons that's not good enough. One reason is those applications are, in quote, dumb communication rather than smart communication. So it gives you the ability to send a point of communication, but that communication may be totally wrong. So it's great that you can send the email at the right time in an automated way, but if the email says the wrong thing because it hasn't guided you or provided the correct email copy, then it's a low engagement, low activation communication. So one issue is that it's not intelligent communication. Another issue is that it's usually single channel. So it's an email or a phone call, or maybe an email, then a phone call. Sometimes you get practices that will layer in an SMS as well, but even 3 touch points is not enough. We know that it takes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In some cases, it might take 12 points of re-engagement. So you need to be able to automate and think about that re-engagement program over much longer than practices currently give credit. So you have another issue around single channel and that programmatic scheduling of different kinds of communication. But the biggest issue is actually what happens when they do reactivate. Because if you've got all of this outbound communication happening to these different patients are going to start surfacing. Oh yeah, I had this issue. Oh yeah, I want to come back in. And the question is, what do you do then? And the big difference between our approach and most other follow-up applications or automated re-engagement programs is that we actually close the loop. So we're taking that patient not only from activation back into the clinic's line of sight, but all the way back into the appointment, all the way back into the calendar. And what's really interesting when you've got recall patients, that many of them have conditions, specific instances that need resolution beyond automatically book back in. Very simple example, we work with a dental clinic. They have people on these monthly recurring membership programs. One person had an expiry in that recurring membership program, and they were then reactivated almost 2 years later. And the clinic took a decision to say, you know what, we're happy to support this patient because they didn't come in when they were supposed to, and now we're happy to welcome them back. But that wouldn't be possible if you take a purely rules-based approach because there's actually some form of human judgment or there's some kind of contextual judgment that a pure play application just won't catch. So you need to have intelligence in that workflow. It has to be omni-channel and it has to be over a sustained period of time. It cannot be one and done because patients need more. And that's not what they're currently getting.
My next question might piss off some people. Hopefully it doesn't. You've worked with so many different kind of clinic owners, right? Not just leaders, clinic owners. What are some of the typical characteristics? We talked about this in the past. There are two different distinct, obviously we generalizing it massively, but they're classically two typically different clinic owner types, right? One that has been pretty difficult for Coherent to work with. And another type, what's the best way to phrase it? Very
Easy to work with.
Easy to work with,
Yeah.
to say the least. Can you describe
Yeah.
what are those differences in terms of characteristics and more importantly, why?
Yeah. I'll start with the ones we love. So we love our clients. I think we love our clients in a way that most technology businesses may not even know their clients. We love our clients because we engage so deeply in their workflows with their patient body that it genuinely feels like partnership when it works well. And so some of the characteristics of it working well are we're pulling in the same direction. So here's an example of pulling in the same direction. We might contact a patient 5 times, but then that patient is with the practice at the front desk because they're accustomed to doing that rather than booking through us. That sounds like a great outcome. We're pulling in the same direction. The patient was reactivated. There was a booking. We were able to deliver a great experience for the patient. That's a win. The contra to that is, oh, they booked through us. So are we pulling in the same direction or are we nitpicking and pulling in opposite directions? And that's one very big difference in terms of providers that we really enjoy partnering with, as opposed to those who are very interested in going line by line to say, that's a regular patient of ours. What's a regular patient of yours? We haven't been in 3 years. They're actually not a regular patient. And so are we having a conversation about who came in yesterday? Or are we having a conversation about the reality of patient circumstances? Because oftentimes we find that some practitioners, if I turn the page for a minute, some practitioners, some providers say, I know my patient body. I know where people are in their journey. And what we come to find is that they will look at a name and they'll say, oh yeah, that's this person's regular patient. See, that may be true, but this person's regular patient hasn't seen you in 24 months. So it's great that in your head, they are regular, but the reality is that they're 24 months off their due date for an appointment. And so we have this tension versus this joy. On the joyful side, it's, hey, let's experiment, let's learn, let's grow together, let's pull in the same direction. On the other side, it's let's review every line and let's make sure that each of these patients are yours versus ours. It's actually, we're not set up for success in that situation. And neither is the clinic, because what we should be doing is saying, are we pulling in the same direction? Are we trying to get to the same outcome? The outcome here is delivering a great experience for patients and delivering revenue uplift, risk compression, and engagement for the practice. And that is not always a science. Sometimes there is more art form in that relationship, in the sense that we might reach out to a patient, we might engage with a patient who is somewhere along a spaghetti bowl of a patient journey rather than a straight through line in the way that the provider might think. So that's one of the big differentiating characteristics, is purely around systems access, which I know sounds like an administrative point, but it's really hard to integrate deeply and to collaborate closely with a clinic if that clinic does not know where their own tools are and their own systems are. That doesn't mean that it's always without friction, but as a provider, your tools, not necessarily your clinical tools, your commercial tools, your software, this is the equipment that you need to deliver the right experience. So if you're using software that is 10 years out of date, that is hosted on-prem, that has no active API, and you're expecting to be able to deliver innovative solutions to your patient body, that is an uphill battle. So you've made decisions to work on a legacy stack, and that legacy stack does not support the future of patient engagement, the future of working closely with patients and with third-party providers. That can be quite a challenge. And we had an experience once where the provider that we worked with was wonderful. They had an incredible care for their patient body, but there was literally no way to get data out of the system with the exception of download, upload, and to do that on a 48-hour delay through TeamViewer remote access to complete a booking. That is a lot of friction to jump through. We're looking for providers who are thinking about how to use a combination of solutions to deliver a great outcome for their patients and who see what we do as a natural extension of that work. and who are making decisions to work on a modern software stack in order to bring together this 360-degree outcome for patients, because it's never all going to be in one place.
How do you define modern software stack in this context?
Yeah, you can draw the line on modern software stack in many different ways. I think the simplest criteria are, and this sounds crazy given that it is 2026, but is it cloud-based and does it have open API access? Like, both of those things should have been true 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The fact that we're still asking questions of that in healthcare points to a problem with the system of record, the EMR, EHR, the practice management software. These are legacy tools that are phenomenally embedded, really hard to rip out. And you shouldn't rip them out. But those tools need to have flexibility. They need to give you the ability to do things outside of a closed ecosystem. Otherwise, you're locked in. You can't do anything that the provider does not deem to be worth their time. So for us, the bare minimum is, do you have API access? And are you cloud-based? And oftentimes we find that the answer is no to at least one of those.
Generally speaking, the younger generation of clinic owners that are more entrepreneurial, more ambitious, and more commercially minded than the older generation, the old guard of single clinician-based clinics. And these people are generally more innovative, they're more open to change, open to new things. Is that a competitive advantage?
I think if you fall into the category of entrepreneur clinician or clinic entrepreneur or practice entrepreneur, people who are thinking about providing great care and about running a business, I think it is not a question of if, it's a question of when. It is inevitable that people who are solving for service, in addition to solving for, are going to win the race. They're going to build differentiated brands. They're going to unlock word of mouth referral. They're going to cut their acquisition costs. They're going to have distribution that old school providers will simply not be able to hang on to, irrespective of the kind of care. Whether you are a respiratory physician, whether you're a knee surgeon, whether you're a dentist, building brand, building service wins. And there are some incredible dental groups in particular that have built really vibrant brands, communities, almost social followings around them for your teeth. And they win because they have that sense of community and that sense of service and that sense of delivery. So for us, when we see a practice that is thinking about brand, that is thinking about service, in addition to thinking about care, that is a strong trigger for us to say, yeah, we're interested in working here. We're interested in working with you because we have a shared vision for delivering success to your patient body. Whereas when we have other practices that are saying, you know what, the only thing that matters here is the clinical intervention, there's truth in that, but equally that does not serve the patient. It serves a clinical and often an academic agenda. And so for us, we're really interested in understanding not just the medical outcome, but the service-based and commercial outcome. And you see a very strong split down the middle of provider types, providers that are growing, expanding, opening new locations, evolving their brand, working with more patients. And on the other hand, practices that are struggling to keep doors open, losing patients, not retaining patients. These are very strong indicators of which kind of practice leader is sitting at the helm of that clinic.
We talked about clinics using really powerful softwares, but using a fraction or maybe less than 10% of what's possible with it. A big reason was there is no user. They didn't have the right marketing or tech person to actually operate the software to maximize its results. Is that also true for this new generation of clinic owners, these entrepreneurial clinic owners?
Yeah, inevitably the answer is yes, because as the clinic grows, you get to a certain size where the clinic owner is no longer hands on the tools. If you're a younger, tech-savvy practice owner, then sure, you have an advantage because you're willing to invest deeply in the tools. But as the practice grows, you inevitably start to get further away from the tools that drive the day-to-day. And then you start to encounter this problem of very spec'd capabilities in the software, very low utilization. We have a relationship that we're trying to build with a CRM provider that focuses on healthcare, and they acknowledge this problem. They say, hey, we work with a lot of practices. Most of them don't use our full feature set. We try to schedule customer success calls with them, but they don't necessarily engage with us. And so you have a tool that's being used, like having a car and only ever driving it in second gear. Then hold on a minute, this thing isn't working. Why can't I go faster? Why isn't it serving my needs? And so you end up with this inevitable tension where software fails to get adoption in the healthcare space because people are so overwhelmed with the feature set and not necessarily getting the right outcome. And because a lot of the users for that frontline tool stack, people are sitting at reception in the front office, they are in service and operational roles. They are not technology roles. And assuming that someone who's sitting at the front desk or focusing on patient intake should also be deeply engaging in how to build automated workflows and all the other things that you'd expect in modern software is just wrong. So there is no user for the tools that are trying to solve this problem, which is exactly why we've taken the approach of, we're not going to give you the tool. We use our own tool. We're going to give you the user who knows how to do these things because they do it all day. That's their bread and butter. So there's a very big shift happening right now between people who are selling seats for a license. You've got 10 people at your front office, 20 people at your front office. We're going to charge you per seat. And providers who are saying, you know what? We're just going to charge you to do the job. Don't worry about how we do. We might use a hammer. We might use a wrench. We're going to try and deliver the outcome. And that's what you're paying for. You're paying for the outcome. Whereas in the old world, you're paying for the software, then you're paying for a user. So now you've got tech and a salary cost on top of it. And you still don't have the right outcome because more often than not, you're not using the full feature set. So this idea that more software solves the problem is not right. The reality is that you need people who will use the tool in the right way. That's the hard person to find, because when you're paying someone to sit at front office and you expect them to have 5 years of experience in patient intake, they have not spent 5 years of experience mastering software, especially your software, which they probably haven't seen before.
Shouldn't AI be the answer for these software companies, including PMS, CRM? Shouldn't, in time, not sure if it's weeks or months or years, when AI is deeply integrated into CRM, shouldn't that solve the user problem, the lack of user problem? Or isn't that something that Coherent is building to?
What will happen when the system of record or where the core stack starts to overlay agentic or AI native capabilities? One way to look at that is we have no idea. We're still very early in the cycle and it's unclear how that will materialize. But the second issue is that the information that AI is sitting on top of is not always clean. And so now you're trying to run automation and overlay intelligence on very bad data. It's like hiring a team member, not giving them the context, not training them properly, and then saying, go off and do that. And the other problem is that a lot of the nuances around implementing this kind of tech don't sit in the system of record. So as a simple example, going back to our conversation about standard operating procedures, these don't live natively in the PMS. And so where exactly is this intelligence going to draw when that SOP starts to update? You need to have a CRM done for you, but you need the inputs to be really strong. And without strong inputs, you're going to run into a lot of legacy challenges. And I think this is what we're seeing in some of the practices already that we work with who have tried AI-only tools, and it works really well when it works. But when it doesn't work, it's hugely problematic, not only because you have hallucinations, but also because they're just doing the wrong thing. It loses context, it loses awareness. It's very different to try and deploy an AI agent inside of a front of house, a dynamic healthcare environment, than to deploy it inside of a code base. A code base is heavily structured. There's rich information. It has guardrails. In a front office clinical environment, those guardrails don't exist. And so the question is, when you roll the dice, what happens?
Can you think of a clinic owner or several clinic owners using HubSpot and they're trying to do follow-up or recall with HubSpot? Can you do a rough comparison of how it looked like to set up follow-up sequences in HubSpot versus how Coherent's approach or how Coherent does it?
You're looking at structured CRM, something like HubSpot. What you're trying to do is set up conditions. You're trying to set up very rigid rules. When a patient does this thing or doesn't do this thing, then start my sequence. Let it run. Full stop. Maybe they let it run on email, SMS, maybe they layer in a phone call, but it's let it run. There's no optimization in that workflow. It's just when this happens, then do this. If this, then that. It's a very different reality for us when we think about follow-up. We're trying to understand why this patient and why now. This patient has come in for a certain thing. There's a certain comment. There's a certain concern. What's going on in their visit history? Have they come in every 4 weeks and then suddenly there's a gap? Or have they come in every 4 years, in which case the behavior is much more normalized? So we're trying to understand what is going on with this specific patient and their specific journey that might influence what we say. Not that we say something, but what do we say? because someone's behavior in their clinical journey should inform the communication. Not necessarily the medical notes, but more so the visit frequency. Hey, here's someone who comes in every 12 months. So the fact that they've fallen off in HubSpot world means re-engage them. But actually, they've fallen off because that's in keeping with how they engage with the practice. So really, the time to re-engage them is at month 13 because they come in every 12 months. So that contextual knowledge around the patient journey is really hard to build into a legacy CRM because you're focusing on rules-based conditions. And those rules might work for new leads reaching out to you because there's a standard flow of communication. But as you move through the patient journey, that complexity and nuance starts to set in. The question is, how do you manage that? And it's very hard to do in a world where you're setting up a series of if-then statements. If they don't do this, then do that. But what happens if they do that and they don't do that? And then they actually do this. And then they ask some random question that makes no sense in the context of their journey, or they're upset about something. You don't want to just send them the next email. You want to adapt the flow. That adaptive communication is what's different between rule-based and intelligent communication and management of the patient body. Trying to build really rich context to understand, how is this patient experiencing the practice? Where are they in the journey? What do we know about them? And how does that information tell us what to do next? As opposed to just do this thing next because that person is now at the end of their X number of appointment. I think the structure of traditional CRM is transactional. It is programmatic. It's not focusing on relational context, relational delivery, relational engagement. Relational engagement feels like someone's talking to you. Transactional engagement feels like you have a structured thing in a structured time, which unsurprisingly is why people don't engage with it. Because if someone sends me an email as a patient, or someone sends me a text message as a patient that says, hey, you've just finished your 4th appointment. It's time to book your 5th appointment. Now is the time. I disregard that right away. That is spam off the bat. If someone reaches out to me and says, hey, we haven't seen you in a couple weeks. How are you feeling? We want to make sure you're okay. We understand from your last appointment that this and this was said. I'm going to engage in that in a completely different way. I'm going to feel like someone is speaking to me. So I think that evolution from transactional communication to relational communication is how you start to melt those barriers between patients who disengage and patients who are excited to come back. The reality is that when you connect or integrate a horizontal generic CRM, which may be very good at what it does, but is not right for healthcare, when you connect that to your EMR, EHR, when you connect that to your practice management software, it is specifically designed to enable actions at a certain time. It doesn't care what those actions are. There's no contextual relational intelligence around those actions. It's purely a matter of when someone reaches out to me in this thing, send them that thing. There's no understanding around what's being said, how it's being said, why it's being said. And also, if the patient then engages or communicates or provides feedback back into the system, that system doesn't understand the context. That system doesn't incorporate that information. Simple example is if a patient reaches out to you on channel A, let's say they reach out to you on SMS, you should immediately turn off all of the other correspondence because it's just noise for them. They like to engage with you on SMS. Turn off the email, turn off the WhatsApp, stop phone call, just engage them on SMS. That's obviously where they want to communicate. That's a relational awareness. This is someone who likes to communicate on SMS. Hold on a minute. This is someone who likes to communicate on SMS in the morning. And even better, they're most responsive on Monday. Why? I don't know. Maybe they don't work on Monday. But narrowing in on where and when that patient wants to engage, that gives you the unlock, because now we know if I message Joe at 9 a.m. on Monday, they're going to be in the pocket ready to speak. Or maybe if I try and take payment from a certain patient around a billing matter on the last Friday of the month, we're going to have a successful event, as opposed to if I reach out to them for payment around a billing matter on the first Friday of the month, because obviously it's pre-paycheck. That relational understanding changes what you say and when you say it. It changes how you reach out to them. It changes when you ask them to do something. Those changes form the basis of contextual understanding with that needs to accrue and compound over time. Patients that understand the practice is there to support them, not transact with them. Patients that feel connected to the provider. Providers that understand how to communicate with their patients rather than just sending out the monthly blast, which is completely dead real estate. That relationship forms long-term care, and it ensures clinical compliance and improved outcomes.